Hey guys, and welcome to my channel. So patch 5.4 is just around the corner, the servers are down, and you know what that means? That means that we have the full patch notes, including all of the job changes right in front of us. So this video is going to be me going over them, and a little bit of insight into why those changes might have happened, and why I think they could actually be really good. So before I actually get into any of the buffs or the changes, Monk is not in this video. If you are looking for Monk changes, that is going to be in a future video. I need more time to talk and to consult and to really process all of these changes because it is like multiple pages worth of changes. And so you're going to have to wait for that one. As always, if this video helps you in any way, I would super incredibly appreciate if you threw patch notes at that like button and cat daddy that subscribe button. Starting off with the Dragoon, we are seeing three big buffs to them. First of all is the dot, so the damage over time portion of the Chaos Thrust ability is having its potency increase from 45 to 50, and while that may just seem like a small 5 potency increase, that's on every tick of the damage over time effect, and that damage over time effect of Chaos Thrust should be up practically all the time during a fight, and so that's going to be a quite significant potency boost over an entire fight. Next up is Fang and Claw, having its potency increased by 10 at the end of the combo, and then Wheeling Thrust, also having its combo potency increased by 10 to a total of 370 as well. Likewise, all these changes are going to go a long way to actually increasing the Dragoon's personal DPS. Now let's crack open FF logs and get some data onto why this might be a really good change. And so right now, if I'm pulling up Shiva at the 75th percentile, we can see that Dragoon is currently sitting about 17.9 thousand DPS, which is absolutely good. One thing about Final Fantasy XIV that's really nice is that like these numbers are fairly close together. But what we can see here, just comparing the numbers, is that we can see that Samurai and Ninja are pulling a decent bit ahead of Dragoon right now. So likewise, this is going to address that a bit. Now let's look into personal DPS versus raid DPS. And just as a quick refresher for everyone, is that raid DPS will include things that you throw to the party, such as buffs, so Dragoon's Battle Litany, or their eye buff that they're going to give a party member. And so if we look at this breakdown of one of the top Dragoons who have cleared Shiva Savage, is that Battle Litany is making up about 1000 DPS just on its own, just as an ability, and then the left eye, which is their eye buff ability that they can give to one other person, is making up about 330 DPS. And so likewise, these buffs are not going to buff what they can contribute to the raid like Battle Litany or the eye buff, but they are going to be increasing the Dragoon's personal DPS, which we are going to see make Dragoon be a little bit more sturdy on its own in dungeons if, say, they aren't in a team that is carrying as much of their own weight as one Dragoon might have hoped. So in other words, they're a little bit more self-reliant and a little less reliant on others to perform well to be optimal. Although I should say, like, not by much, but this buff is pushing them more into that direction. They're still going to be heavy buff centric. And likewise, if we pull up the top 50 breakdown from FF logs on Shiva Savage clears, we can see that for patch 5.3 that Dragoon was actually making up the lion's share of the melee DPS representation at 56.7%, which is quite high. So Dragoon, regardless of doing a little less damage, is still clearly a very popular DPS. Hopefully though, with these buffs, that's going to give the Dragoon a little bit more of a kick in their own department and make them a little bit more self-reliant. That takes us to our second DPS class getting buffs, which is the Ninja. So we are seeing a 10% potency increase to both Spinning Edge and Gust Slash. Likewise, when looking into the Ninja's numbers, we're going to be looking at raid DPS, and we can see that the Ninja is going to currently be the 5th highest DPS in the 75th percentile. But what we interestingly enough see is if we look at the max numbers, we can see that the difference between the absolute highest max number that we have here, which is going to be the Samurai at 20.6 thousand DPS, and then the Ninja, is actually only a slim margin of 300 DPS difference, meaning that the Ninja is absolutely not to be played with. It is a huge force, and Trick Attack has been long loved in this game and a massive raid utility. So looking at the number one top Shiva clear in the entire world, we can see that we are looking at Trick Attack doing a total DPS of over 2,000 DPS just from Trick Attack alone, which is absolutely mind-boggling when you think about it. What these buffs are going to do is they're going to buff up the Ninja's personal representation of their DPS a little bit more, so similar to the Dragoon, if their party isn't necessarily performing as well as they might have hoped in, say, dungeons or normal raids, then the Ninja can actually stand a little bit better on its own 2 feet. These buffs are just going to push it a little bit more in that direction. Looking at the top 50 clears, we can see that the Ninja is actually doing really well at representing 34% of melee DPS in all of the Shiva Savage clears, clearly making it quite a strong pick, although it is losing to Samurai by a little bit, and so these buffs are probably just to even out the playing field a little bit. Now comes ranged DPS in Bard, and I'm actually really personally excited as a ranged DPS player in Raid to see this buff. So Bard is getting a 10% potency increased on burst shot, which while that definitely doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not going to be revolutionary, burst shot is one of our most used ability that we spam almost constantly, and so this is going to definitely represent quite a decent DPS boost for the Bard. To put some numbers to it, unfortunately the Bard is right with the Dancer as the second lowest DPS that we have right now on Shiva's Savage clears, and it is a notable 1,000, over 1,100 DPS lower than our current reigning champion at the 75th percentile, which is the Black Mage, and so it is falling quite a bit behind its competitors. Especially when we look at the max numbers, we can see that it is doing roughly 2,000 less DPS at the absolute maximum numbers, where Samurai, as we said before, is at 20.6k, we are at 18.7 roughly k. So it's a little bit lacking, and hopefully this buff, just because we spam it so much, is going to add a lot. Just to give you a good idea of how much we use this ability though, if we pull up a damage profile of one of the top Bard players, we can see that their burst shot actually makes up a grand total of 4.1 thousand DPS, a little more actually, which is absolutely mind-boggling because that is just how much we use that ability. As you can see, even other abilities just start plummeting. Like the second highest is going to be Refulgent Arrow. We can then see Bloodletter is like basically like a third of it, and then we just go down and down and down. And so seeing any potency buff to burst shot is going to definitely be something that we do notice quite a bit. Likewise, interestingly enough, just seeing this personal DPS buff on another buffing class is actually really interesting, because very similar to Ninja and Dragoon, what the Bard brings to the party in terms of utility is a lot of DPS buffs. Like if we look at this Bard's damage profile, we can see that Battle Voice is contributing 800 DPS, then we have Mage's Ballad doing roughly 400, we can see Wander's Minuet doing roughly 400, and then we can do Aramis Paeon for roughly 150. And adding up all of these numbers leads to a total DPS contribution to the raid of 1,731.7, which is absolutely nothing to sneeze at. But again, we are looking at another buffing class having its personal damage amplified quite a bit, and so this is looking very good, and I am actually really excited to see how this is actually going to pan out, because right now I can say when I'm looking at a ranged DPS to play, Bard has lately been falling to the wayside just because it's not offering quite as much kick as the Machinist, and hopefully this is going to bring it a little bit higher. And then lastly, because I'm just doing this as a trend I guess now in this video, is that like looking at the top 50 Shiva clear groups, Bard is making up a pretty terrifying 3.8% value of how many people are using Bard in these groups. So 3.8% is really bad. It's the lowest of any job currently being used. So here's hoping that this really helps out the Bard, because I want to play all three ranged DPS packs. Now onto our fourth DPS is the Red Mage with pretty big buffs as well, and so again this is all going to be personal DPS buffs, and we are seeing Jolt 2 get a 10% potency increase to 290, and we're seeing Enhanced Riposte get a buff to 220, and Enhanced Jolt being increased from 300 to 310 on both Verfire and Verstone. So likewise, all of these buffs are going to be adding up to giving the Red Mage's core rotation, because they're using Jolt 2 a heck of a lot. They're using Verfire and Verstone a heck of a lot. They are going to push the Red Mage's personal DPS quite a significant margin. I'd say I'm actually really fascinated with these changes for Red Mage, because if we pull up the Shiva's 75th percentile clears, we can see that the Red Mage is actually the 4th highest DPS in the entire category, which is really high, especially when you consider that the Red Mage is bringing also the revive spam utility, so that is very interesting to me. Although to be absolutely fair, the caster DPS on the 75th percentile are absolutely rocking it, with Black Mage being the absolute #1 currently ranked here, and then Summoner just slightly behind, meaning that caster DPS, is this technically making the Red Mage on a more even playing field with them? Yes, although it is, as a ranged DPS main myself, making me feel a little insecure seeing that a DPS that's doing so much more damage is getting buffed, and I'm like, oh my god. But I digress. Looking at the DPS profiles of one of the top red mage clears, we can see that Burst Stone is currently making up roughly 1,600% of the red mage's DPS, and then for Fire is making up about 1,200 DPS. And then Jolt 2 is making up a significantly lower margin at 700 DPS. So likewise, are these going to be as impactful, these buffs, as the Bard's Burst Shot? Maybe as a whole, but generally speaking, these are not going to be as significantly used as some of the other red mage abilities, just because the red mage is trying to minimize how much they're using Jolt 2, but likewise they are also going to be using a heck of a lot of their Fire and their Stone, and so that is going to be represented much higher. One thing to note is that in the top 50 clears, we are seeing maybe why the red mage was still getting these buffs, which is looking at the caster DPS. Honestly, red mage is bringing up the absolute rear at 20% of the pick. Likewise, not as bad as Bard, clearly, but we are seeing that the summoner is currently absolutely dominating the tier, and then black mage is quite a bit behind too. So maybe next patch we will see black mage buffs, but that is pure speculation on my part, and we'll see. Next up are Scholar changes, which are bringing in a few different changes. There are going to be buffs and nerfs in here. So first off is a nerf to energy drain, reducing the potency of energy drain from 150 to 100. Then we're going to see the damage over time effect of biolysis be increased from 60 to 70. And so again, as any damage over time effect being amplified, we are going to be seeing this consistent 10 potency increase through every single tick of that dot through the fight. And so this is going to add up to be a lot more than you're just seeing here. And likewise, Broil 3, having its potency increased from 280 to 290 is going to be our filler spell that we spam, and so that's going to be a lot more represented than it looks at first sight. So pulling up the FF-Log's damage numbers, comparing Astrologian, White Mage, and Scholar, we are seeing that the Scholar is actually, unfortunately, below the 10,000 mark, which is quite unfortunate. Are these DPS numbers staggeringly different between one another? No, I don't want to sound alarmist. Like, in reality, this is like 600 potency difference between Astrologian and Scholar. Like, you can still obviously clear content in Scholar, I want to emphasize that. But it is a notable difference, which is quite unfortunate. As well as the maximum, comparing the maximum numbers, we can see that the Astrologian is hitting 13.5 thousand, and then Scholar is at 12.8, and so it's roughly 1,000 difference. I mean 700, but you know what I mean. Likewise, pulling one of the top Scholar's damage profiles, we can see that their Broil spell is making up about 17.4 raid DPS, or 17.6 thousand in normal aggregated DPS for them themselves, their personal DPS. And then what we can see is that Biolysis is coming up at the rear at about 1.8 thousand DPS, which is not bad. But likewise, we can see that these buffs are going to be highly impactful, and likewise boost the Scholar quite a bit in their personal DPS department. This is also really good because, as you can see, like the other buffing classes like Chain Stratagem for the Scholar, it's making up about 1,000 of their DPS contribution to the raid, and so seeing personal DPS boosts is going to likewise help them in things like dungeons, when they're, in particular, since we're looking at single target buffs, in particular they are going to be a bit better on dungeon bosses, and likewise this is going to definitely boost Scholars a little bit more in personal DPS, which could make them a little bit more self-reliant. Lastly, if we are going to just keep on the trend of looking at the top 50 groups, if we pull up all of the healers for the top 50 groups, we can see that Scholar is bringing up the rear by a considerable margin at 21% pick rate. And so out of 3 healers, if it was all perfectly even in an over idealistic world, you'd expect 33, 33, 33. Well, 0.3333 continuing. But essentially here, we're seeing that Astrologian and White Mage are definitely taking up a lot more of the Scholars' places in here, and so we are seeing people drift away from Scholar, and hopefully these buffs in particular will go a few steps in making things a little bit more balanced, a little bit more even. But now everyone has been asking me, why am I not freaking out about the nerf to energy drain? And so energy drain had 50 potency cut from it, and so every time that the Scholar refills their 3 stacks of Aether Flow, they get a grand total of 150 potency removed from this nerf, in theory, if every single one of them is going to energy drain. So what I'm seeing here, or what I'm speculating is the goal of the developers, is that they wanted to take the real draw for a scholar to, instead of using things like healing spells or like in Dom or something like that, they want you to instead not feel like you have to spend every single stack of Aether Flow in energy drain to get the maximum DPS. And so I'm seeing them shift the power out of energy drain and into other parts of the kit. So overall, as a whole, I actually think that this frees up the scholar to do a lot more healing, and overall that's going to make a life as a scholar a lot easier, in my humble opinion. Of course, we're going to have to wait and see how that actually shakes up, but I really do see this as a good shift, so that you aren't being on scholar and just like, oh my god, I need to put everything into energy drain or my DPS is going to fall. I feel like they're disincentivizing that approach and letting you be a little bit more liberal on where you want to put the Aether Flow. So to me, net positive as a whole. And lastly, that brings me to Monk, which Monk is a can of worms that I am still going to be trying to pick apart, as you're probably watching this video, mind you, and try and understand a bit more, because could I just read off the notes to you mindlessly? I mean, I could. Some people will, but not me. I'm going to try and understand what's going on a bit better, consult some of my friends who are good Monk players, and see what's going on there. So that's not in this video, and likewise, hopefully you'll keep your eyes peeled out for that. Anyhow, that goes all for this video, and I hope that you learned a lot and see the buffs and where they come from, and kind of like look at how or why these maybe happen. And anyhow, if you appreciated this video and want to help me, I would super appreciate if you threw patch notes at that like button and cat daddy that subscribe button. Anyhow, that is all for this video. I really hope that you have a fantastic day.